January 7th, 1941. In the midst of World War II, Pearl Harbor is attacked by Japan. This brings the United States into the war. First, they look across the Pacific Ocean, to the country that attacked them. But Japan is far away, and they then turn to their own country, and their own people. What follows is one of the most infamous events in contemporary U.S. history, one that we'd like to forget. But the heinous crimes committed and perpetuated throughout the internment of Japanese Americans in the United States cannot be forgiven. These were crimes committed against American citizens on American soil. These were Americans ripped away from their homes, their lives, their hope. This happened in a so-called land of freedom, to people supposed free, and these atrocities were only recognized 46 years after the fact. The effects of this rippled throughout America, but we will observe the effects on one city in particular, Chicago. The documentary you are about to see is a detailed view of the internment and subsequent forced resettlement of Japanese Americans from the western states into Chicago. I will present opinions of my own, but I will attempt to support them with objective evidence. February 19th, 1942. The Second World War is in full swing, and Woodrow Wilson is the President of the United States. Due to the events at Pearl Harbor more than a year ago, the U.S. has entered the war against Japan. This has led to rising tensions and propaganda against Japanese Americans. There have been concerns of a so-called fifth column, a group of Japanese Americans prepared to suddenly undermine the U.S. from within at a signal from Japan. These fears were merely racist and hateful fear-mongering, and without any actual basis in fact. They are generally considered to have been instigated by Frank Knox, the Secretary of the Navy from 1940 to his death in office in 1944. When he visited Pearl Harbor a few days after the December 7th attack, he made an unsubstantiated claim that the Japanese Americans living on the island had sabotaged the ships and planes in the harbor in conjunction with the attacks. Although there was no basis whatsoever for these claims, and many soldiers stationed at the harbor refuted them strongly, the accusation sparked and lit a fire that would continue to rage long after the war. After Frank Knox gave an accusatory report to the president and the public, the animosity towards Japanese Americans increased greatly. A few months later, Walter Lippmann, an influential newspaper columnist, wrote a column titled "The Fifth Column on the Coast." This repeated the accusations of Frank Knox and drew even more public attention. These events are thought by many to have contributed to the signing of Executive Order 9066. Executive Order 9066 was the presidential decree signed on February 19th, 1942, that allowed the Secretary of War and any military commander he appointed to prescribe military areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. Although the order does not refer to Japanese Americans by name, they were by far the most targeted group, although a few people of other nationalities were interned. Because of the order, more than 110,000 Japanese Americans living primarily on the West Coast were removed from their homes, jobs, and lives. Most were sent to inland camps in Idaho, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and Arizona. A few were as far east as Arkansas. Most would remain in these camps for nearly 4 years. Some would die there. The interned Japanese Americans were primarily Issei, or first-generation Japanese immigrants. Some were also Nisei, or second-generation Japanese immigrants, and the children of Issei. In the camps, they suffered poor housing, poor utilities, and food budgets as low as 75 cents per capita. Temperatures were as low as -30 degrees, and the Japanese Americans in the camps were constantly ridiculed and insulted by the resident soldiers. This was pure and constant human suffering, and it can only be attributed to the government of the United States. March 20th, 1946. As the final internment camp closes, the interned Japanese Americans have been released and are spreading across the country. However, many are not allowed to return to their previous homes. Instead, they are relocated to cities in the northern United States, from Missouri and Minnesota to the East Coast. One of these cities is Chicago. government organization designed to facilitate the internment and this resettlement is the War Relocation Authority, or the WRA. The purpose of the WRA is, in short, to make Japanese Americans less Japanese and more American. The WRA discourages meetings of Japanese Americans and encourages assimilation into white society. This is an attempt to prevent Japanese Americans from feeling that they are part of a group or community. The WRA also discourages leaving unsafe and low-paying jobs for better ones, stating that the resettlers have to contribute to their community by accepting jobs nobody else will take, and leaving better-paying occupations for Chicago's white population. Outwardly, the Japanese Americans of Chicago are forced to go unnoticed. However, they refuse to assimilate. They continue to meet, have community events, and establish aid societies. They also readily leave unsuitable working conditions in favor of safer, higher-paying jobs. And this leads to the hateful stereotype of Japanese Americans as lazy and ungrateful to their employers, both untrue allegations that in reality are simply the Japanese Americans' readiness to leave jobs that they don't want to be in, a characteristic obviously shared by the white population, but fueled on by racism and hate nonetheless. Another issue faced by Chicago's Japanese American population is housing. Both white and black Chicagoans are unaccepting of their presence in a community, so the only places they can live are the so-called gray zones, areas between black and white communities in which houses are sold to any race. There are relatively few of these gray zones, and due to large influx of Japanese Americans to Chicago, Japanese American communities began to form. Within these communities, and within Chicago as a whole, Japanese American businesses form. Because of white Chicagoans' unwillingness to hire Japanese Americans, they are forced to be self-employed, starting businesses such as restaurants, grocery stores, or aid firms for other Japanese Americans. The majority of these businesses do very well, and many are still around today. As Chicago's Japanese American communities grow, new members begin to come of their own volition. Some non-interned native Japanese citizens emigrate to Chicago specifically. At its height, the Japanese American population in Chicago consisted of nearly 30,000 individuals. However, between 1950 and 1960, Japanese Americans who had been forcibly relocated to Chicago had earned enough to return to their original homes on the West Coast. They had been forced to completely rebuild their lives, even though many of them had been extremely successful before their internment. After 5 to 10 years, they had finally built up the necessary resources to return to their previous homes. Unfortunately, many of their homes and businesses had been destroyed or looted, and most had to build their lives from nearly nothing once again. After this migration ends, there are approximately 15,000 Japanese Americans remaining in Chicago. Many are Issei who arrived from Japan after the internment. Some are Nisei and the children of interned Issei. The Nisei have stayed behind after their parents returned to their former West Coast homes. There are also a fair amount of formerly interned Issei who have elected to stay in Chicago. Many of the formerly interned Issei have stayed behind due to successful restaurants or businesses. These businesses include many aid societies and community centers established to provide assistance that Japanese Americans in Chicago would not otherwise have, such as bilingual newspapers, celebration of traditional festivals, or lessons in English. A substantial amount of these societies and restaurants are still around today, and they played an incredibly substantial role in the forming of the Chicago we know today. From 1942 to 1946, during the bulk of the resettlement, Chicago had finally recovered from the Great Depression, and Chicagoans were enjoying their renewed economic security. As they tried new experiences and diversified into enjoyment of new cultures and ideas, the Japanese American businesses and restaurants in Chicago provided a view of an incredibly different life, a world away from the then current culture and community of Chicago. Chicagoans' minds were open to new cultures, new places, and eventually, new people. Eventually, Chicago's Japanese American population slowly began to move toward the suburbs. This may have been prompted by a phenomenon colloquially known as white flight, a gradual migration of wealthy white citizens of a city from more central neighborhoods to the outskirts of a city. The former gray zones in which Japanese Americans had formed communities were of less prevalence in the city, but still existent. These areas followed wealthier white Chicagoans out of the city, and most Japanese Americans went with them. Many Japanese Americans remain in the suburbs of Chicago today. Some the children of internees, some their children, and even a few surviving internees themselves. None of these people will soon forget the travesties committed against them and their families. It was, and still remains, an act that cannot be forgotten. Today, as tensions with foreign countries increase, and America turns once more to its resident immigrants, we would all do good to remember the crimes committed by the United States government against its own people. This can never be allowed to happen again. We, the people, cannot allow it.